Hello, everybody. It is 6 o'clock here in the UK. And before we get going, could someone give me a quick thumbs up that they can see the presentation and can hear me? Yep, which is great. All good. Thanks, Roger. Lovely that you're here, which is great. So today we are going to be talking about a bit of data analysis. We're in the part of the year where many of us are not racing. We're either putting back together our cars, building out new cars. I've seen a number of posts from friends today who are installing data systems or indeed are working through some of their data and data analysis. So I thought at this time of year, probably best to sort of put configuration to one side and more focus today's conversation around AIM data analysis, which is really going to be focused today. So my name is James Colborn. I do a lot of videos online and I do a lot of seminars with AIM as a sort of independent but partner of AIM, I should say. And so in many respects, today's conversation is really based upon many of the experiences that I have had as a racer using AIM devices now for the best part of, God, every time I say this, the years roll on. So it's probably more than 10 years now, but it's been quite a long time. And so the other thing we're also going to focus on as we go through today is looking at some of the new software that is being produced by AIM. And so everything we're going to do today is focused on workflows using Race Studio 3 analysis, which is in beta now. If you haven't downloaded it yet, it's available on any of the websites from aimshop.com all the way through to aimsports.com. You can get the software to be able to use, and it's well worth starting to practice because the beta has now been out for a little while. And every single release and version that goes by, a small improvement and enhancement is made to the point where now it's in a really good position to be able to use as your primary or to use on a regular basis. And no better time to be able to use it from a bit of data analysis. Now, one of the things I'll also say is a bit of housekeeping before we get going. The first is if you wouldn't mind keeping yourselves on mute during the conversation. Not that I don't necessarily want to hear from you, that's not at all. I think it's lovely if we have a chat. It's just in case there's some sort of additional conversation or a call that comes in or a visitor that comes into the room, which is the first thing. And then the second thing is there are folks from AIM who are on this call. And so if you have questions, it'd be lovely to see the chat box working away, which we often see as the presentation is given, to save me having to sort of stop and start as we go through to answer questions. And what we'll do is we'll probably have quite a significant sort of Q&A at the end, which generally tends to happen as we look through some of the content. So let's get into where we're going. So today we're looking at workflows. It's not uncommon that you go to YouTube today and you can look for workflows on anything from workflows on how to use Photoshop, on workflows on how to be able to use Excel and any kind of software and application to use. And the software is no different from AIM, and data analysis is no different, because workflows are quite important because they allow you to be able to address different scenarios as they happen. And so what we're going to be looking at today is looking at what do you do in scenarios where you have very little time, you have a bit of time, and then I think we did put one in the end as well that said, what if you had all the time in the world, which I think at that point, that could be any manner of time, but if you just have time to be able to go through more detail and more analysis than you need, because different scenarios work in different types of scenario. Oftentimes we may find ourselves in situations where we only have a few minutes. I mean, at the last event that I ran, you may have been out of the car for less than 30 minutes before you're back in the car to be able to run through a heat that goes into a semi-final, that goes into a final or something like that. And so in many respects, you just don't have enough time to be able to really get into the data, but there may be something you want to have a look at. There may be something you want to be able to monitor. Similarly, you may have oodles of time. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been at the racetrack, but driver's briefing is oftentimes at 8 a.m. The first session might not be until 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And so with all that time, data analysis oftentimes becomes one of the things that people do. So we're going to look at these in different scenarios. So let's click on this and see if it moves to the next slide, which is great. So what we're going to cover is we're going to really focus on, and it's interesting that I do webinars here with AIM Shop for the UK and international market. I also do occasional webinars with AIM Sports in the US as well, where cover all manners of different topics. And one of the things that we've addressed in previous sessions, which I thought this will be a really good session for today, is that we've looked at ways that people want to be able to learn from and analyze their data, because not all of us are the same. And I'll explain that as we go through. But not all of us, I should say, really sort of want to look at graphs. Some of us may want to look at video. Some of us may want to be able to look at sort of images or track maps or something like that. And so really figuring out what your preferred choice is will really help determine what type of method of analysis you use as you get into that time sort of crunch that you may have all the way through to all the time in the world. So we're going to look at that. The next is preparation for data analysis at the track. One of the things that I often find happens is that people will plug in their device, they'll download their data files, and then they'll arguably be sort of then looking at where is the treasure in this treasure trove, without any idea in terms of what they're necessarily looking for. And so it is very difficult if you don't know what you're looking for to be able to find anything as you open up a data file. And so one of the things that's really important is to be able to prepare for what you want to find in that data. And we're going to address that as we go through in a little bit. The next is we're going to have a look at some data analysis, and I'll just click on a few of my own files. I'll be in Ray Studio 3 analysis, and we look at some of the processes and the workflows that I work through as we go forward. And then the final thing is really just starting, if we do get sort of a chance to be able to say this is a quick 5-minute analysis, which might be 4 minutes, it might be 3 minutes, but it's something you have when you have an extremely small window of time. It might come to the fact that you've got a lot of work to be able to do on your car. Just like all of us, it might come to the fact that we've gone off and done a bit of bench racing and haven't had time to be able to look at the data. And so what do we do in those sort of scenarios? And so let's click on this and look at the next one. Now, one of the other things I might add is you may be noticing I'm turning like this. I'm actually using a webcam that's on the side today. So I'm not distracted. I'm actually just looking at different areas. So please forgive me if I'm not looking directly at the camera the whole time. Before you analyze any data file, I think the most important thing is, what do you want to know? What do you want to know? If you think about it in many respects, when you use a data file, depending on what type of device that you have, you're going to be presented with a whole load of channels and information that has been gathered during a session you've had on track. And depending on the type of system that you use, this might be limited to movement type data if you're using a GPS-based device, all the way through to engine information and vehicle information if you happen to be using one of the data loggers that has a lot of information that's being captured. And so it's really important as you look at this is, why are you downloading the data file and what do you want to be able to have a look for? Because that's really important. And I think it falls into a few key areas. First and foremost, and this is where I spend most of my time, is how do I go faster? How do I improve my lap time? How do I do better as a driver? And so when I look to download the data files and I want to be able to analyze it for driver performance, the most important thing that I'm looking for is, how do you actually use this data to be a better driver, to do a better job on track, and be able to analyze that data. But the second thing we may want to have a look at is, we may be in a situation where we want to be able to do some kind of vehicle health report. One of the things that I generally tend to do after every session is I download the file and I run what we call user profiles, which I'll talk about as we go through, that really just focuses on the performance of the vehicle. How hot did it get? Did I have any over revs? How far did I travel when I was over a certain threshold of RPMs? What happened to the oil temperature? I drive a Formula Ford, so there's no way of being able to charge the battery as you're out in a session. So what happened to the voltage of the car? All of these things may be interesting to be able to download, so you can make sure that you're analyzing that and you can start to see particular issues. I'll talk about this in terms of scenarios as we go through, but there have been instances where you may want to change a decision that you make in terms of a gear choice in a certain corner. If you see certain over revs, you might want to get to the point where you don't forget to charge your battery just in case you run out of voltage. All these things are actually really important as we look through, so we'll talk about that as we go through. And then I think the third thing is there anything you want to be able to do in terms of chassis and setup changes? Are you gathering information that may be coming in from suspension travel, for example? Are you looking at information in relation to vehicle dynamics that you may want to be able to adjust, that might actually be coming from just movement data? It might be coming from steering wheel that's showing if the car is, the driver's rapidly moving the steering wheel and sort of addressing an absolute ton of oversteer. There might be a setup change. And so those are the three things. So it's really important before you go in to think about what you want to know, because this is going to change how you set up your workflow to be able to address some of those challenges, and it will speed you up no end when you're at the track. I mean, it gets to the point now where there's certain information that 2 or 3 clicks of a button, a quick glance at the screen, and many people will be able to walk away after that being able to go, that's exactly what I wanted to be able to see. I'm happy. I'm going to focus on this going forward. And that's where you want to be, but you don't want to be sitting there clicking, trying to find things and going, what am I looking for, when you download the data and you're at the track. You just rarely ever have enough time. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at, the first thing is, how do you learn? Now, it's important to think about how you learn, because it's really sort of indicative as to which sometimes type of device you might be using. Also interesting in terms of how you set up your views as you go forward. And as we go through this webinar, I'll explain what I'm talking about in more detail, and I'll show you in a sort of live preview. So it all hopefully will start to come together. Now, many of us are able to read graphs and charts very quickly and be able to say, I've spotted this particular situation at this corner, and this is happening. And if that's the case, then maybe graphs are right for you to be able to get that instant type of information. Similarly, you might be somebody who is looking at where exactly was I on track? What did my line look like through those particular corners? And you may be somebody who looks at maps and imagery instead to be able to say, well, I actually like to look at what my line looks like on the track, and therefore this is a focal point that I always look at, because I know that if I'm not driving online, there's something which is not right and I'm not happy with the car, and it may make the decision to be able to log what the car is doing next time you go out. So imagery is really important, and maps especially. And then the third is video, and video is becoming more and more sort of a key component to analyzing your data. And it sounds like an odd thing to say, because many of us see video and we look at our video afterwards, and it's almost that's the best way to describe it. It can be sort of almost like a way of being able to share something which has been exciting, like this was a desperately exciting race, and I got a video to be able to share and have a look at. But how do you use the video to be able to analyze what you were doing as a driver and how you potentially adjust and change that? And so we're going to look at what that means in relation to aspects such as the SmartyCam, which not only shows you the video data, but it also shows you what you're doing as a driver, most importantly, with your feet. And so if I'm somebody and I've got a very short window of time, I might just grab the SD card out of my SmartyCam, plug it into my laptop, find a few laps that were there, and immediately I can start to see there's hesitation getting to full throttle. Why is that happening? The brake application is brake, release, brake. So if I got sort of to improve my my brake references, and I can see very quickly with video, without necessarily needing to look at graphs and charts, where I need to find improvements. And that's something that I personally prefer to be able to do, especially if I've got a small window of time. If I've got a longer window of time, I may combine that with some graphs and charts. Similarly, if I don't have video, I may revert to graphs. And so know how you like to look at the data really is an important component. Plus, it's also key to be able to recognize that not everyone has the luxurious position of having a SmartyCam and a log of all the files, and you may just have an AIM Solo 2. And if that's the case, doesn't matter. There's a brilliant workflow that you can use, which we're just about to walk through, that it doesn't matter what kind of device you have. This is the type of thinking that you have. But it's really important. And if you don't know, maybe spend some time thinking about, where do you go naturally when you look at data, and really think about, subconsciously, you might be immediately moving to graphs and not even thought this is the primary. Many of you may be looking at videos straight and foremost. What's the first thing that you go to when you download the data or you get out of the car? Because that might be the primary, which will help you shorten that window of time if you're looking at being able to analyze data quickly, or if you want to have more time. Similarly, I shouldn't say similarly, but interestingly, if you want to be able to do all of them together, this is where the beauty of the new beta software exists. And this is why I recommended, especially while we're in the winter months, we're going to be working on our cars and maybe doing all sorts of stuff, to download the data. And now's the time to give it a whirl and give it a chance to be able to use. If you're interested in terms of how to be able to use it, there are videos from many different sources. There are some on my channel, there are many on the AIM Sports channel, and of course there are some on AIM Shop, which are available as in previous webinars we've done. So now might be a great time to be able to have a look at that, because as you can see, I'm pointing over here for no reason at all because you're looking at the screen, but over here for me, you can see that we've got all of those combined together. We've got the graphs, the charts, the video, and the map and the overlay to be able to see all that information. So really figure out what you want to be able to see and how you can use it. because you get to this point where you want to be able to find your insights and find them quickly. And this is something that was taught to me by somebody who's on the call, Roger from AIM in the US. And it's something that has stuck with me ever since. And it started to evolve as we look at new ways of being able to analyze the data, is that there are sort of, it used to be sort of 3 key components, and now we've added a 4th with this one. And I might add, this is where if you've got an AIM Solo 2, that's great. Even an AIM Solo 1 file, you can do most of this information. I'll explain what I mean as we go through. So the first thing I ever look at, if I'm comparing data files and I'm looking at laps, and you can see I've got 2 laps that are on the screen here. One's a 1 minute 14.4 and one's a 1 minute 14.3. And so I want to be able to see why was I faster or different than the first one. So the first area I look at is area number 1 on the screen, and you can see that's the time compare bar. If there's a point in the lap where the lines start to distance themselves, there's a difference between the two. Now, the fastest line will always stay as that reference point, the one solid line that is there. And then the additional lap will show in terms of how has that lap compared. So you can see if in this instance, by the time we get to where this line is shown on the chart here, about 4,000 feet, you can see that at this point, there's a 1/10 plus of a second difference between what's happening with the driving on one lap versus the other. And so the question is why, and why is that happening? And so the next thing is to go up to point number 2, hitting things in my office. The next thing is to go up to point number 2 is to look at why is that happening? And why is usually, or nearly always, faster or slower at the same point on track, one lap versus the other. If you're faster or slower, that may have a sort of a knock-on effect as to what happens with your lap time. And ideally, what you're looking at here is you're looking the optimum to be as fast as you can at a certain point at any given on track, as to what the car and the driver is capable of doing. And so it's important to have a look here as we study through this data as to about why is that happening. And so if, for example, I happen to look, and I'm scrolling the mouse here, hopefully you can see it. If this line starts to slow here, and then I come up to why is that happening? And then we can start looking here. Well, it's because the red line is a little bit later on the brakes and carrying that speed into the corner, whereas the blue lap is a little bit slower. The next thing is how. What is the driver doing? How is that happening? And this is where the driver gets involved. Now, if you have a GPS device, all you'll do is substitute this area number 3, and I've shared profiles with people before and happy to share them again, where instead of in this instance, you've got throttle and brake, which is coming from the driver, what you'll change it for is you'll change it for GPS data. And in many instances, I use GPS longitudinal data, because down indicates deceleration and up indicates sort of like a transition and then acceleration. But in many of these instances, the aspect in terms of how is that happening? Well, it's because in this instance, you can see this is the throttle. The driver lets off the throttle here on the blue lap and also applies the brake a little bit harder. And that slows the car down a little bit more, which you can see here. So what's happened is here, why it's happening here, and then what the driver, in this case, it's always me, I usually use as comparison, because I've got a million excuses for why I'm doing something, which makes my webinars always so entertaining, I hope. But in many instances, you can see here that we overslow a little bit here. And so the question is how's that happening and what's the driver doing? Now, we can start looking at a little bit more data later on. But the last thing we also want to be able to then have a look at is where is that happening? And this is one of the advantages. Now, remember, it doesn't matter what device you have. If your purpose and goal is to be able to create a workflow where you can work faster and you work more efficiently with your data when you're at the track, and you want to go faster as a driver, and you've got an AIM Solo 2, something like this is perfect. Because what you can see in this instance, you can still see where you're slowing down, you can see the speed, you can see what happens on the time distance, and you can also see where it's happening at a particular given point on track. And so you can set this up ahead of time if this is the workflow you want to work through. So this is how my brain works. This is how I've been taught, but it's something that I graduate sort of, sometimes you get taught something and you sort of progress with, well, I like to see it slightly different. But in this instance, this is exactly, and I have these lined up. So immediately I look at the bottom, I look at the top, I look at the middle. That's exactly how I work through these things. So if I download a data file, the first thing I can do is actually go and find that information that is there. So that's important. Now, the next thing I want to be able to talk about is you think about that's my workflow. is the next thing we want to be able to talk about is setting up something which is called a user profile. Now, we've talked about this in the past. There are great videos online about user profiles, but think about a user profile as a customized view that allows you to be able to see what you want to be able to see when you're at the track. You set these up typically ahead of time. I set up my user profiles with previous data files before I get to the track. So the moment I download that data file from my Solo 2 all the way through in this instance to an Evo 4S, the first thing I do is press that user profile and this view shows up immediately. This is exactly what I look for and this is what shows up, and I can analyze the data very quickly. Now, to be able to do that, you want to be able to then start saying, well, what do I need to see? So one of the things you may have all probably started to notice, I've got a little arrow here that's pointed at this. This is a time distance. This is a time distance graph, and this is page 1 of what I believe are 3. There's actually 4 on here, but I'm only going to focus on 3 in this instance. 3 pages which every single driver can get the maximum out of any device and compare with other people's devices quite simply in terms of driver input. Now, the first is time distance. What we're looking at right here is the time distance, which gives you this quick workflow. The second one, and if I click forward, you can notice that the arrows move to that track area there. Set this up as a user profile, so it's working. Is you can see that I've got this track set up, which gives me line. And so one of the beauties of the Race Studio 3 analysis software is that it automatically takes your driven line and overlays it on something like Google Earth, which is what's being used here. If you were using the older version, Race Studio 2 analysis, and I might add, one of the things that I will say is if you're still very much comfortable with the previous version of the software, nearly all of these profiles are available and and you can use it in that instance, but it just gets a little bit more complicated. For example, if you wanted to do what I'm showing you here in Race Studio 3 analysis, it would take you best part of 30 seconds to load the user profile, whereas in Race Studio 2 analysis, you'd have to find the laps you wanted, download them as a Google Earth file, load it up in Google Earth, then color the laps you wanted to be able to see, and then wonder which ones you're referencing and working through it. So this gives you a lot more information very quickly, and that's why it doesn't matter what device you have. This is a great way, and it shows you in this instance line, so you can start seeing line that's there. So this is the second page. And I may have said this in webinars before, but this is the second page, which I think is essential no matter what you're doing. If you want to find driver improvement, and this is what you want to learn, how do I get quicker with the data that I'm just about to download? This is the second page. And then there's a third. There's a third page, which I recommend people use. You notice that this little arrow has moved over something called split times report. This split times report will break the track down into the segments that you want. Now, this will happen automatically for you by the AIM device. Especially in the new software, you won't have to build a track map and do it yourself. It'll do it for you. And the way that AIM devices usually work is green means straight. If I get this wrong, someone from AIM will correct me. I'll apologize. Green means straight. A red section means a right-hand turn, and a blue section means a left-hand turn. And so what it'll do is break it down. But what I've done, and again, we're going to go through these in future webinars. We've covered these. There are videos available to help you. But again, trial and error is there. Is that what I've done is I've created the segments to represent the corners. At this instance, this is Castle Combe. And what I've done is I've gone in and said, that's the first corner called Avon Rise, which means I can talk to a colleague of mine who might be a fellow racer. I'm like, hey, I'm doing this at Avon Rise. Can you tell me what's going on? Or more likely, it's going to be the Blue Corner Quarry, which is where a lot of time is gained and lost because it's quite a commitment corner. And I know there's somebody else, at least on this webinar, who's done that corner. And in this instance, what you can see is that we can break it down. And then what it'll do is it'll show you all the lap times and then broken down into each of these segments. And so what we start looking at here, and this is why this is super important, is that this is where we want to start looking at consistency. There's a few ways of doing it. And when we go into the live preview, if you've got a short period of time, this split time report will give you a quick view of consistency that is really useful to be able to see. Because what you can also see is this section number 1 called Avon Rise is also the same section which is highlighted here in area number 3. I've gone 1, 3, 2, but I'll explain that in just a minute. I labeled these slightly wrong this morning. You can see where these lines are close, there's consistency, and where they're far apart, there's inconsistency in terms of speed. And you can see that represented here in a color combination. Again, doesn't matter if you're using an AIM Solo 2 or whatever you're doing. This is the workflow that you can use to be able to go through and say, where am I being consistent and inconsistent? And the closer the laps are in terms of time, the closer the greens will be. If there's greens, oranges, and reds, there's inconsistency in time that is there, which is an area that you may want to clean up, because we all know that if you put in a quick lap and you can do that quick lap 10 times in a row, it's great in a race. If you do it once and no idea how you did it and then can't repeat it, that's a problem that you want to be able to resolve. Now, the only downfall of this scenario is if you're doing 1:14s every lap and everyone else is doing 1:13s, that's a different problem. But in this instance, we're looking at consistency. And then the last thing this split times report will do is it will show you this is what your best theoretical lap would be if you ran all your best segments through each of these particular areas. Plus, of course, you've got additional information here in terms of where those segments are on the map itself. And so this is the user profile which I set up for the workflow, which is if I've got a short period of time, I need to know that information very quickly. This is what I want to be able to see. And so this is if I want to drive faster. I'm going to look at this in more detail, but it just helps you set this up. Now I have a scatter graph on here as well, which we'll talk through that in a little bit more detail because I've evolved that for the next thing, which is the next thing that I wanted to be able to know is first things first, I want to be able to assess how I'm doing as a driver. In fact, I'm actually telling a false, a fib in this instance. What I actually do is I do vehicle health first, and then I do driver analysis, because vehicle health, if you don't get that right, you might not even complete the next session. And I'll show you what that looks like. And that's a workflow which I've set up, which is a user profile, which is a click of a button. And I'm going to show you these in a live preview in the second half of this demonstration. And so this, as you can see, I'm going to scroll backwards. Notice how this one's called driver. If I click to this one's renamed vehicle analysis. So this is something which I've changed. So when I'm actually downloaded the data file now, if you've got an AIM Solo 2, this is really not an option for you with all of these different channels. This is if you're somebody who's running a logger where you're getting data either from your car's ECU or you're getting information that's coming in from analog channels which are feeding into a logger, which is what's happening with my car, which doesn't have an ECU, I should say. And so in this instance, I've clicked the button, same data file, same information that's been downloaded, but I don't want to, in this instance, what I want to know now is I want to know what's actually happening with the car so I can make sure that I'm sort of addressing certain key aspects. So this runs in a flow. And again, the way that the workflow works is how I look left to right to be able to see key components. And so you can see on this one, I've got few key areas that have come up. Now, the first is a max RPM. I want to see if I've had an overrev. And so you can see here that the answer is yes, I have. In lap 9, I had an overrev on this particular point. So that gives me reason to be able to go in and have a dig in, maybe into the data, maybe to look at whether this was one of those flutters that's coming in from the RPM coil in terms of the signal, or whether it's genuinely a missed shift or an overrev that is there. So that's the first thing which I look at from a vehicle health point of view. Then I look at the water temperature and the average and the max, just to be able to understand what's happening there. A dynamic which I only started to really learn more when I moved back to the UK from the US is whether your engine is actually too cold as much as too hot, which is interesting to be able to see if it's running a little bit colder than it needs to. That said, anyone who's run at Thunderhill in December knows how cold that can be as well. But in many instances, this just gives me an idea. And so again, my flow is moving across here. The third is I look at oil pressure. I think we all do in many instances, but I look at the minimum and I look at the averages, and you can see what happens as the oil starts to thin, as the engine gets hotter, and what happens to the pressure. Then we talked about engine sort of external voltage. Now, this is the voltage coming in from the battery in my car. Now, this is interesting. I've had an alternator fail on a more modern BMW where we've lost voltage. Interestingly, this is a case where voltage sort of deteriorates sort of slightly over time through the session based upon the fact that the battery doesn't have a charging capability. But I remember reading a racer in my class who didn't start a race because the battery failed as they got to the grid. And interestingly, if they'd run this analysis beforehand, they could see it was trickling down. Now, for our point of view, this actually happened to me. It was either last year or the year before. It wasn't the battery, which we changed 2 or 3 times. It turned out to be the charger. But this is a vehicle health component, which would actually stop me running a session, which is why I would look at this workflow first. Then I look at some other aspects I've thrown in here, for example, average tire pressure and temps. If any of you attended the tire pressure monitoring session that we did last time round, it's available on YouTube to be able to look at. We can start looking at what happens to tire temps and pressures as we go forward. I always think the increase in temperature in tire is always very interesting as we want to, and this is where, okay, so I want to go into a little bit more analysis and I've got more time. This is something that I would potentially look at in more detail. Is you can see that on lap 1, we start at 16 degrees centigrade tire temperature, and then we go up to 41 degrees by the time we come in on lap 10. And so where within this window is the optimum point of view? And then the last thing I look at, and I know I'm explaining these, but this is how my workflow works very quickly to be able to see, is I put in 2 scatter graphs at the bottom, which allow me to be able to see where I'm, what the oil pressure is based upon 2 key components. What's the oil pressure in speed and RPMs, which is the color component, and then what's the oil pressure in relation to lateral acceleration. Where it's red, it's the revs are really high. And so you can see that in this instance, I don't have any instances on this scatter where the oil pressure drops below, in this instance on the left hand, 36 PSI, which is fine. But, and this is not necessarily something which is a common issue in terms of right and left, it is the oil slosh around. But I actually had to install a baffle in a BMW I used to run, because at certain points in any given track, you would go around corners where the lateral G-force would slosh the oil away from the pickup point. And so the oil pressure would drop. And so as a result, this is the type of information I would look at. So this is an engine health type of workflow that you look at going through. And so these are the things that I use to be able to really start to sort of look through. But before we get into the demonstration, the key component is, what are you going to do about it? And this is an odd thing to say, because workflows are really designed to be able to say, well, we've identified 3 things, and we really focused on 2 for the essence of time, which is in today's webinar. The first is, how do I do better as a driver? And then the second that we've looked at is, what is the vehicle health? And what's the workflow for getting that information that I need very quickly? But what's interesting is that the question then becomes, what are you going to do about it? And is it a case of, I could drive better, and so I'm going to drive better in terms of what it is? If we're looking at the driver improvement point of view, there's certain key aspects. Now, I'm going back to sort of racing school tutelage that I had when I started racing years ago, which was, okay, so you're going to go back out. What are the 3 things that you're potentially going to work on? Any more than 3 and you'll forget, any less than 3 and you're missing the opportunity of being able to improve. And so that might be a case of, based on this analysis I've done quickly, I could carry a little bit more speed into, in this instance that we saw earlier, the quarry corner, because I've done it once. I need to do that more consistently to be able to take that a little bit further, because a 1/10 or 2 means all the difference in a spec series, which I think we're all probably aware of. A 1/10 of a 2 makes a difference in nearly everything we do. The last race that I ran, from position number 1 to 23 or 24 was less than 0.8 of a second. And so when you're talking about a 1/10 or 2 going into a corner, this is an instance where you know that a 1/10 or 2 will make a difference. And so what you're going to do about it? Well, I might change my brake reference. Sorry, that was a bit unprofessional. Sorry about that. To cough. What else are you going to do? Well, maybe I could look at my line. Am I going to change my line and adjust that as I need to, which is there? Am I going to roll a bit more speed? And so these are the things that you need to be able to make sure you're comfortable with as you go through, because just looking for data, what you're looking for. And if you find something, what are you going to do about it? Similarly, if we go to that vehicle health point of view, well, what are you going to do about that over rev? Well, where's it happening? And do I need to change my shift lights that are on my particular device to be able to change that? And similarly, if there's an instance of, we've got issues with oil pressure, is that a case of doing an awful job with heel and toe? What is the scenario that exists that is causing some of these particular, and then what are you going to do about it? Which is one of the things that I often see. People look at data and they walk away, and then they do exactly the same thing the next session because they didn't go out and figure out looking at a plan. And so I was getting a bit preachy doing these things, so I apologize if it sounds a bit like that. But at the same time, if you're going to go to the effort of building these user profiles and beautiful workflows, the question is what are you going to do about the information that you've just learned? which means that you're going to be able to continue to race, continue to improve, or in the case of vehicle health, actually be able to run. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch to a live demo. So hopefully you should still see my screen, but I'm going to load up Race Studio 3 analysis, which I've got here. Now, if someone can just comment in the box to let me know if they can see this information. Let's thumbs up. Can you see? Yep. Thank you very much to everyone for letting me know, which is great. I also recognize I'm using one of these new you can use your camera, like I've got an SLR here, but every time I move my hand, it changes the focus. So if I go to focus, sorry about that. I'm trying to learn and play with something new. So what I'm going to do now is I'm probably going to be faced like this. And so, apologize if it's you see the side of my head. But in this instance, what I've got here is this is Race Studio 3. This is the latest one I just installed. It came out on the 20th instead of the 22nd. So it's the very latest that we have here. And these are all the sessions. This is every session that I ran in 2021, which is where we are right now. And I've just got all of my sessions on here because this is my home computer. This is my race laptop. This is one that I use at home. I use this, as you can probably see from the fact that we're on a full screen share. You can see that I use it for iRacing and a few other things that are there. We actually might address iRacing and things in future demos because you can use iRacing data in AIM and in Race Studio 3 analysis, which is brilliant if you want to be able to practice something at home in a simulator and then analyze the data and practice doing it with data at the same time. And so we're going to cover that off next year in future webinars. But in instance, I've just loaded all of my personal files on here. And the first thing you can see is that I've also linked all of my data files with video files because I'm lucky enough to have a SmartyCam and an Evo 4S with loggers that are capturing all sorts of different information within the vehicle. So we're going to look at some of these sort of areas that are here. So we'll look at that as we go through and look at some of those key components. If you see one that's on its own, notice this one is here. This might be a situation where on November the 6th, the idiot who owns the car forgot to put the SD card in the SmartyCam. I mean, it just happens. But in instance, this is what happened here. But if that's the case, you'll just see a data file that is here. Similarly, if you just see a video file, you might just have video, no data. But most of these are linked together. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at a few of these because I want to be able to analyze some data, or I want to be able to have a look at what do I do very quickly and what can I do if I had a little bit more time. And so the first thing I want to be able to have a look through is if I click on any of these, one of the things you'll notice is that it shows me all of the lap times that I had in that session. This is a really interesting one because I've got a whole bunch of sessions here. If I move this in terms of scanning, it's sort of, there were good laps in the middle, but then they sort of fell apart again. Now, granted, this is a race, so chances are there's more information here than meets the eye. But this might be a good one in terms of having a look at consistency and everything. And so you can see this as you look at the data, and you get a lot of additional sort of data to analyze here. In this instance, I've just got the lap times and seeing consistency. That's a bit flicking on the screen, sorry about that. But if I click up here as well, you can get certain information that you need to see. And this relates to aspects such as what was the weather on that day, which I don't know how many of you write down what the weather was doing on that day, but this I think is one of the best features that is there because you'll remember, oh yeah, it was really hot that day. But how hot was it? Was it really hot? Was it just a hot day? And how did that impact performance? Because we all know that ambient temperature is the best excuse for why we're a second or two slower on our race laps because it's a hot day. And so, well, for me anyway, it sort of like would have been 2 seconds faster if it wasn't 25 degrees centigrade outside, which is probably not true. But in many instances, this is a really useful thing to be able to just make sure you got that reference point. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up one of these sessions. And the first thing you're going to notice is I've got that profile with time, distance, track, and split reports that is loaded. Now, if you're wondering where I've got the profile from in case I want to change it, I'm going to walk through that because one of the things that I said earlier is the first thing that I like to do is I like to do vehicle health before I actually like to do driver analysis because I want to give the team and the engineers as long as possible to be able to fix any issues with the car because we can do that simultaneously while I'm looking at data. If you wait 15 minutes after you've done data analysis, or even 5 minutes, that might be 5 minutes that stops you getting on track. So what I've actually done here is up here in this little cog in the top left. If I click there and I scroll down here, there's something called load profile. And I've got 3 that are loaded on this. I've got driver analysis, which is loaded, which was the last one I used. I've got vehicle analysis, and I've got tire analysis. Now, I'm going to do tire analysis right at the end because that's the longest and it takes a bit of time to be able to go through. And unless you're somebody who's really good at it, which there are lots of people who are really good at it, I'm still learning how to do that. And so that's something which I need more time to look through. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this one that says vehicle analysis. And as I do, one of the things you'll notice is that I told you how fast it was in terms of being able to change in terms of a workflow. That's how fast it was. I can just give a quick demonstration. If you've loaded these before you get to the track, that's how quickly you can load your workflow once you've loaded a data file with all of the information that's available. And this is why getting it done before you get to the track is super important, because then you can just click up here and flick through these. And we're going to do vehicle analysis first of all. Now, one of the things you'll see here is exactly what I showed you earlier. In this instance, I've actually added a few things. I've been playing around in the quieter December months of playing around with Race Studio 3 analysis. And I've actually added a couple of bits of components on here, but you can see that this is what we talked about in that demonstration. You can see that I've got the lap times that are here. You can see what the RPMs were, which in this were pretty tame and pretty straightforward. I've also added in something called time and distance. This is in meters and this is in seconds. How long in seconds was I over a threshold, which I put at 7,000 RPM. So it's showing up a little bit here, but I've put a filter on this and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But how long was I over 7,000 RPM, which I want to be able to monitor, because earlier this year, I had instances where I was 20, 30 seconds over in a lap over 7,000 RPM, which for an old Formula Ford engine is not good. Plus, you don't get any power over there anyway. And so we turned out it was a gearing analysis that we looked through. And so this gives me seconds and distance. Anyone who's interested in that, we're going to look at these later next year in terms of a math channel analysis that is there. But as we go through, this is my workflow. It shows me that engine temp was fine, water temp on average was fine, oil pressures were fine there. Interesting that the battery was sort of ebbing and flowing. And what I did was I did minimum, because we know that the minimum of the battery is important. It doesn't matter how much charge it's got, it's how little charge it's got, which is really important. So I added that in there, which we can see there may be something that put a little slight draw, and you can see that all of a sudden it starts to drop to 11.7. Nothing to worry about, but I need to make sure this is charged between each and every session and the charge is going in so that I can run the next session. So this might be an instance where if that drops to anywhere that says 10, 10.9, 10.8, whatever need be, that's where we make sure, is it charging? Is the battery all right? So remember, this is the workflow that I go through when I come straight in, download the data, off we go in terms of analyzing this particular aspect. And then we've got all our oil pressure analysis that's down here. Now, right now, this is just for one lap. It looks fine. But up here, what I can do is I can click on this laps button and I can select the best 5 just to see how it's doing. I can use the scroll wheel on my mouse and be able to say, yep, that all looks fine to me. There's hardly any instances where the oil pressure, regardless of the G-force, drops down. And in terms of speed, I'm not doing high speeds with low oil pressure. So everything there looks fine in terms of that respect as well. So I'm done with this. This is all I needed to do. I'm pretty comfortable with this. I'm not worried about that over rev because it looks a little bit sort of, it looks all right in terms of where it is. So I can move on. I'm not worried about something which needs to be addressed immediately. And I can do that, if I wasn't explaining it, in under a minute. And that's just an important component to be able to think through. If you've got this ability to see all of these key variables in that quick a period of time, no need to worry. Now you can rest easy that the car is going to be fine for the next session, and you can move, well, as best as it potentially could be for the next session, I might add, and you can move on to the next particular component. Now there's additional stuff you can add in. You can have channels for everything. You can do air fuel mix, you can do all sorts of stuff, but at the same time, these are the channels that I have. So this is what I look at. So then what I do is I'm like, okay, next thing I want to be able to do is just flick quite quickly to driver analysis. So again, I'm moving quickly to driver analysis. And the first place I want to be able to start is I want to be able to have a look at performance on track. And so one of the things I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to select best 3 laps, just to thin it down just a little bit to be able to see. And this is showing me my best 3 laps that were there. And you can see green is the fastest. There's the reference lap. And you can see here that in some instances, I was actually doing slightly better on a certain lap. And then I may have actually approached a corner. In this instance, the red lap was doing well, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. Similarly, the blue lap was doing the best in terms of what was happening here to some degree, and actually doing the worst in terms of slowing, but at the same time, actually did a really good job in this instance of being able to carry speed. And so what's happening at certain points on track, I can start analyzing the data. But more than anything else, the one thing that I'm looking at here, and anyone who's analyzed my data, of which there are people on this call who've done that, will probably think it's a bit messy and untidy there. But certain things, one of the key components that I may want to have a look at here is the fact that the blue lap is actually the fastest through COPS. So I've got a few options here. I can double click here and load it up and get closer to it. And I can actually look at what's happening with the brake pressure. But in this instance, you can see that going into the corner, blue lap was relatively slimmer, but look at the throttle application coming out of the corner. And so that's a commitment to the corner. Maybe it's something to do with line. And so I can either zoom in here and actually see that, yeah, the blue line actually got closest to apex down here and actually rolled that speed on the outside and then use the track on the outside. And so again, why am I able to do this? Well, why am I faster here? It's because I'm carrying more speed through here. Why am I carrying more speed through there? Because I've actually used the accelerator better that is here, and I've got on the throttle better. How can I get on the accelerator better going through there? Well, I can do that because I've actually done the best line coming through that particular corner. And so that's the way that I work through. You can see very quickly that this would say to me, make sure you're getting the best line that you can through that corner. Because at this particular point, you can see that this, if I click here, that's that 1/10 of a second. Now, remember what I said, it was actually at this track at the event where you had, and I might be fabricating, but I don't think I am. It was the distance between 1 and 23rd was 8/10 or something mad like that. And so just think how many positions you may have lost just coming through this one corner, just with a position or line changer that is there. And so what am I going to do about that? I'm going to do the best job I can of being able to make sure I'm, hitting that apex on the inside and then using all the track on the outside and not trying to roll too much speed through the corner, which you can see in the absolute adverse scenario to that particular equation through COPS here. You can see that the red lap, I'm actually slower going in. So I'm like, all right, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to brake later, which you can see here. So I brake later at this particular point because I'm obviously going a little bit slower. I want to be able to catch up through COPS, which we all know we try too hard, we get more into it, and all of a sudden we've gone in too fast and we've come out too slow. So I broke a little bit later here. And then all of a sudden you can see that while that does give me an instant gain here, it also means that I overslow the car by hanging, by being able to take too much speed off on the brake. And you can see here that they'll go to accelerator, can't make it, have to go back again. And you can see that the adverse happens there, that the slowest line coming through COPS is also in this instance the red line. And so you've got a balance of both of those. The green lap actually looks like a relatively good balance in this instance, but the throttle application on the green lap is horrible. It's like, which we don't want. And so this is one of those scenarios that we could now I could look at this with GPS data as well. So if you're thinking, well, this is all very fancy, but I don't have a throttle position sensor, don't worry. We could absolutely do this just using GPS. And just to demonstrate that, what I can do is I can go here and I can turn off throttle and I can turn off brake and I can turn off RPM and I can scroll down and I can turn on GPS longitudinal. I can make this number 2. Don't worry if I'm going too fast on this. We'll have webinars on how to use these to be able to make sure you're comfortable. But one of the things I will say, this is absolutely trial and error. But do you remember what we were talking about just a minute ago that was there? We were looking at, okay, so that was because I had an Evo 4S. And I'm lucky to have an Evo 4S. I love it. It's great. But at the same time, if you've got a Solo 2 and you just use GPS data, that's fine too as we're looking at driver analysis. Because if we remember, still doing COPS, still get the same what's happening. Well, what's happening here is that the blue lap's doing the best job through COPS and the red lap is doing the worst job. And the green is sort of like a balance in between. And so in this instance, you can still see that if that's the case, you can see that the acceleration of the blue lap is actually relatively smooth coming out of the corner. The green lap back on the lap, and then the red lap is on, off in terms of this, because the GPS device is just moving like this. That's what it's doing. And so it's helping understand what's happening with that movement. So don't worry if you don't have all of the equipment. This is great if you've got the entry-level GPS type data, and you can see exactly the same thing. You can see the speed slows here, the speed is better here, and off you go. So again, a great way of being able to see this. Now, one of the things you may be wondering is, well, hold on a second, you're building profiles as you go, and I am. If I wanted to be able to save this now as something slightly different, if I click on this, I click on Save Profile As, and I do something like RF88, that's my car, and I do driver, GPS, might call this analysis just because. And I click on OK. Now I've got that profile. So if anyone gives me a named solo file, I can potentially compare it with my data as well. And if I want to go back to my profile that I had before, all I need to do is go back to driver analysis. It does that, goes back to the one that's before. But in this instance, we've got exactly the same information again, and I've got my driver input back. And so that speed of creating that workflow and user profile is so interesting, because what this also means is if you're lucky enough to have a fellow driver who will give you their data, and they're using a Solo 2 and you're using an Evo 4S. Now what you can do is you can load up 2 files and you can start looking at the data in a lowest common denominator that everybody has, and using a quick profile that everyone has at that aspect. And so that's as we go through these particular areas looking at this. Now, one of the other things that you may be thinking was, well, hold on a second. I have a SmartyCam. How can I see that information as well? Now up here, there's this little button that's got a video file. And now what we can do in terms of seeing COPS is we want to be able to go through. And what I'm going to do is it's loaded 2 laps here. I've got 3. So let's just go with, which one do I want? Best 2. And do the best lap. And I'm going to go up to my laps, and I'm going to pick let's pick an awful lap, shall we? Let's pick, well, if you were driving in this car in this race and others were doing 3s, you'd be like, well, they're all awful. But let's find an even more awful one, which is this one here, and be able to see what the difference is in terms of what's happening. Now, one of the things that we've talked about with video that gives you additional information is if I now click on this, we can see that the red lap does a better job driving through COPS. And if I double click here, we can see that because you can see that the red lap, the blue lap distances itself. And at this point, it's 0.1 to nearly 0.2 of a second slower coming through that corner. So the question is why? So if I move this back here, not only do I have the option of being able to see what happened with line, but I can also see that there's another variable here, is that it's right here. There's another car. So I'm having a little bit of a race, or maybe having a little bit of fun with another driver, or maybe they've just lapped me, whatever it is. But it's slightly sort of balks the opportunity to be able to potentially have attention focused on doing the best lap and the best line. Maybe I'm focusing too much on the car in front, and it's affecting my ability to be able to potentially apply the throttle in a more smooth particular manner, or there's aspects. So we can go into the detail and look at all sorts of stuff that is there. And all of this is available in your workflows you're looking through. But in many instances, you've probably noticed what's happened. We've gone from being able to have that quick, it's 5 minutes, I've got to be able to get the information I need super fast, super quick, which is what I've been able to do here. I want to be able to see my vehicle analysis super fast. I want to be able to see my driver analysis super fast. But then I started to add video. And then I started to look at different additional information. One of the things you may have also sort of noticed is that if I click on this button that says tire pressure analysis, this also shows me tire pressure. Now, this is something which I'm lucky enough to have tire pressure sensors on my car. If you have, interestingly, if you actually have an opportunity to load tire pressure now, the entry-level price of a tire pressure system has got to the point where it's less than a set of tires, but it may make the set of tires that you have either last for longer or get the most from them. It's one of those sort of cost sort of variables that if 2-3 years ago you'd be looking at $2,000-3,000 or pounds for a tire pressure monitoring system, now you're looking at £300 and less in dollars, I think, in some instances as well. But it starts to allow you to be able to see additional data. But what I've done now is I've switched from your 5-minute workflow view into where we start creeping into that 20 minutes. And that 20 minutes is where you start adding on the additional components that curiosity takes over, or a in-depth analysis that you want to be able to do that you may not necessarily have the luxury and time to be able to do if you want to move quickly. And so, it was very difficult to be able to say, this is what you do if you've got 5 minutes. This is what you do if you've got 20 minutes plus. But what I wanted to do was to demonstrate that just as we go through each of these particular processes, the more you want to get into it, the longer it's going to take. So the key is to be able to find the workflow that gives you the maximum amount of information that you need and the minimum amount of time based upon what you want to be able to achieve. I need to go quicker as a driver. Great. I need to be able to make sure my car can run the next session. Great. Those are 5-minute analysis you can do just like that. I need to be able to make sure that I'm starting to figure out the right tire pressure analysis, or I need to be able to look at different laps in terms of I was in a race, were there other cars? That's where it starts to extend out. And so my sort of advice or guidance as we go through this is the more you get into it, the more you need to get sort of, very comfortable with what you want to achieve in the time that you have between sessions. And it varies. A lot of people are tending to their own cars. They're changing tires. They're, maybe fixing issues that happen based on the previous session. Data analysis becomes a nice to have versus a must have. So how do you make that must have data analysis so short that you still get information that you need so you can improve the next session over? And that's where, the difference between a quick 5-minute user profile that you can put in versus, in this case, you can see here that I've got a ton of information. I can see how the charts develop. If you're all looking at this going, what on earth is he showing here? Let me just add a few things here just to show you what we're looking at in that instance. But what this is showing, just in case you're interested, is this is showing which tire pressure gave the maximum lateral grip. In this case, it was, I need to add an additional scale in here, but it was between sort of, 20.1, 20.2, gave me the maximum grip that is there. Similarly, same sort of tire pressure here, same all around, except for the front left, which in this instance gave a slightly better reading in terms of around 19 PSI. And then this gives you the idea in terms of how long within the range of these 5 laps were you at that particular pressure. And you can see here that I've sort of analyzed this. It said that anything over 21, I lose grip. And I still spent, a good amount of time, in this instance, 23% of the time in a particular lap, over that threshold. And so did I go over tire pressures that were slightly too hot for the conditions to have maximum grip. This gets more interesting, but you can probably see that I'm looking at this thinking, well, hold on a second, I've got to work through this. Not necessarily a 5-minute exercise to be able to work through. This is something, if you have more time, you can start going in and having a look at what the peak performance would be based upon your tire pressures as you go around track. And so hopefully that's useful. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to the one thing I'm going to do is actually going to stop presenting and see if anyone has any questions or comments. I don't know if people have been chatting in the chat box, but oops, don't want to do that. I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions that come up or thoughts. Type them in the chat box, actually, and then I can answer as we go through. But hopefully this was useful for everyone, and sort of the concept of user profiles and workflows makes sense. So I'm just going to move this chat box over here just to see if anyone's going to ask questions. We scroll through here as well, which is good. I'm more interested, just a quick sort of yes, no, and please feel free to say no if that's the case. Was this useful to everyone? Oh, silence is golden. Gonna have to get used to have to set some polls up, which would be good. There's some yeses, which is very kind, which is good. If there aren't any questions, which is unusual, there's usually quite a few questions that do come up. Please feel free to drop me an email. What I'm going to do now is everyone in the meeting, I will share a few key pieces of information that you need to know. Now, the first one, you all know aimshop.com, who are hosting these webinars, which is fantastic for that. The next one that may be useful is, I will add this one in. I've had a question that's been sent to me just before we do that. How am I recording your tire pressures? Well, this is a tire pressure kit that comes from, you can get it on the AIM shop. In fact, if I load up the browser here, I can show you. Oh, not sharing, am I? So I'll put that back up in a sec. But anyway, the answer to the question is that I am logging using a tire pressure monitoring system. If you're interested in how that works, please go back to last month's webinar where we went through tire pressure, the basics in terms of getting it in, not necessarily installation in your vehicle, but which is pretty straightforward. But at the same time, it shows how to be able to set up your dash so you can see your logs, how to set it up so you can see your tire pressures when you're on track, how to set it up so you have an alarm if you have a puncture, which I actually had, and I didn't have an alarm, and I actually drove 5 or 6 laps with a puncture, which I'm rather glad that I had the tire pressure monitor system, but very annoyed myself I didn't set up an alarm. So the last session is definitely something to have a look at on that basis. The next question is my Evo 3 logger compatible with Race Studio 3? I've struggled to date with no luck. I believe that your data files, should they be uploaded, you can export them from Race Studio 2 and then upload them into Race Studio 3 analysis to have a look at. I've gone all the way back to the original AIM Solo and had a look at some of those files that were there. That is a good question though for anyone from AIM, because I'm not sure, but if it's an AIM data file, you know, and Roger's sort of kindly commented. Next question I'll come up with, Kevin, I'll get you, because I've got the same problems yet, and I'm going to show you something, Kevin, in just a second, which may make your life a little bit easier in data analysis. So hold on just a second there. Roger has commented, yes, you can use your Evo 3 files in Race Studio 3, but they'll be a bit limited. I found with the original AIM Solo files, which are now a good 10 years old, that the GPS was a bit spiky and it wasn't as accurate as one of the more modern devices that were there. But at the same time, I was able to get the data into the session. If you want to know how to use those, you know, that's something to cover. Now, next question, I run cross flows, but my revs are all over the place. How do I smooth those out? Right, I'm going to show you. I learned this the other day. I didn't know you could do this, and I absolutely love this feature. So I'm going to reload. I'm going to share with everyone. Hold on a second. So I should be sharing right now, and I'm going to do, let's have a look at, let's close this file and let's open one up. I don't think I've played with the RPMs on yet. Just load this up. Hold on a second, driver analysis. No, I've done this one. Of all the files that I could have picked, I picked a file that I've actually smoothed them out. Let's have a look and see if I've done this one. I'll find one eventually where I can show you this. So here's a great example. Now, there's 2 ways you can solve this. The first is that I have an inline RPM filter, which AIM provides, you can buy from the website, which will smooth out those RPMs. The second thing, remember earlier I said I had an RPM trigger, but it didn't, it said your max RPM is 6,900, and it said you were 0.22 of a second over 7,000 RPM. It's because I have all these funny old spikes right now with the data that is here. What you can do, I only like this, I absolutely love this, didn't know you could do this. You can also do this in Race Studio 2 analysis. So this is one of those aha moments which I still have all the time with the software. If you click on this little asterisk here, you'll find something here called filter. And this is really ugly. So I'm going to go all the way to level 3. And if I click apply and exit, it's just smooth that RPM trace out. So it's far less spiky and difficult to be able to analyze, which I found to be a really good way of being able to work through. Plus, if you do this with the channel, when you load up, in this instance, if I load vehicle analysis, it'll also smooth out the max RPM. So it'll take away if I've had any massive sort of where it's bounced because of the electrical signal. Now, I might be over smoothing this out. And so one of the things that you can do is you can vary depending on what you want to be able to see. Let's go back to driver analysis that is here. Always goes to that page, I'm not sure why. You can actually probably de-smooth this a little bit as you need to. So if I went down to 2, it can crash. Still a beta, still happens all the time. And it's one of those things, God, it sounds awful, doesn't it? It happens all the time. It's designed to happen all the time. So by the time it gets into production, it doesn't happen all the time, I should say. So I'm always, you know, finding ways of being able to make the device have a particular moment. But you can change the filtering, I should say. So that might be something that helps you with your particular. So I've done this one. So if I click on it and I take it down to level 2 and I click on apply and exit, you can see that it's sort of, unfurls itself a little bit. It's slightly less smoothed out as it there. But hopefully this helps with that basis. So you've got RPM inline filter, which I'm having installed in my race car. And then the second thing is if post you want to be able to look at the data, you can also do that as well. So that was the first one. So noisy RPM, absolutely don't totally agree with you. You know, it's intermittent too. I think it depends on the mood of my car. And if it's cross with me, it's awful. But if it's not, sometimes I don't know why it does different things, but there. Does AIM have plans to develop or provide a TPM system for cars? I don't know if there's a port on any of the Microns to be able to have ECU. I don't think there is, because it requires an ECU port. So I don't know the answer to that question. That's one. At the end of the session, I'll provide my email address. I'll forward it on to someone from AIM who may be able to help answer that question. I don't know, because if you remember from last month's webinar, which you haven't seen, you do need to have an ECU port available to you to be able to import in the TPMS system. So I don't think any of the Microns do have an ECU port. So I would say probably not right now, but don't know if there's a future one planned. Any other questions that are here? Crossfire, yeah, we've covered on that. Any other questions that are there? No, fantastic. Right, so writing to everyone here, let's do this. If you have any questions, or you would happen to like to play with some of the profiles that I've just set up, so you can just click. The beauty of these as well, and I'll share this in a minute as well, is that you can import profiles so that you can use a profile that I've designed on your data, especially if it's GPS data, because the beauty of GPS data is that every single channel is exactly the same named on every single device. And so whether you're using Race Studio 2 analysis or Race Studio 3 analysis, GPS data is, as I said, the lowest common denominator. We can all use it. And so it's fantastic from the point of view, it doesn't matter what you're using, we can all compare that data. So that's my email address. Let me just click on enter. If you want to be able to contact me, obviously you will know aimshop.com, and the support folks there are fantastic. They'll help with most of the questions that come up. Typically, email me if you've got questions from the webinar today. If it's something that I can't answer quickly, I will forward you over to the folks at AIM support as well that is there. But with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone attending, especially in a few days before Christmas here in the UK and the holidays around the world. And so thanks for everyone for attending. And I hope to see you all. We've got a nice monthly webinar planned out for next year with lots of different topics. So if you want anything at all, please feel free to send me an email to that address as to topics you'd like to cover as well, because we can always potentially talk about that and introduce it as well. So have a fantastic Christmas to those of you here in the UK. Happy holidays to everyone around the world. And thanks for attending.